butterflies beyond civilization. Weird. The weird and the eerie.
When I say that all our present governments are misfits.
All right, we are back.
Hello.
Hello. And we are Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast. And this week, we're discussing the luminary H.G. Wells.
And specifically, Chapter 2 of The Weird and the Eerie by Mark Fisher.
Called The Weird Against the Worldly, H.G. Wells.
Why this chapter, and he opens up kind of explaining it, which is Chapter 1 he used Lovecraft to kind of drive home his the weird is that which doesn't belong thrust into reality definition. And, you know, of course Lovecraft is sort of the most classic example of that in literature you can kind of think of, plus Lovecraft. It's called weird fiction, and so there's always just been this association just with the word in Lovecraft. And so he opens this chapter saying, I want to now approach the weird from a different angle via reading of H.G. Wells' short story, The Door in the Wall. I believe this story possesses a strong weird charge, even though it is very different than Lovecraft's work. So he's basically saying here is a completely different take on the weird that is nonetheless also in the same category of Lovecraft, even though I think it's completely different than Lovecraft.
Yeah, and I think the way to start out this discussion is to first compare H.P. Lovecraft to H.G. Wells, because they're very different writers, even though they are sort of writing it around the same time. H.G. Wells is an English writer. H.P. Lovecraft is from New England.
Very American.
Yeah, a very American writer. H.P. Lovecraft is a very conservative writer, and H.G. Wells, there's thunder, they heard us. So if there's any thunder in the background, that's just the War of the Worlds happening outside.
Yes. Well, yeah, anyway, as you were saying, H.P. Lovecraft has a very strong reputation for the reactionary.
Yeah, he's a very conservative writer, and H.G. Wells is a very turn of the 20th century progressive writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think lifelong socialist activist is a perfectly appropriate.
He is firmly within a socialist background, and that makes it very interesting comparing the two, one against the other, and how they use the weird to bounce off each other. So, a little bit more about H.G. Wells before we get into it. You probably know him the most from his longer novels, such as The Time Machine, or The War of the Worlds, or The Invisible Man, although that's less known.
Then everything else you know of his is actually by Jules Verne, so that's it.
Marlowe has been confusing H.G. Wells with Jules Verne.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by H.G. Wells.
So this is an interesting way for Fisher to frame this.
I mean, the chapter is specifically on one short story of H.G. Wells. It's not on H.G. Wells as a whole, but, I mean, an interesting enough guy. We did a bit of a broad look at his stuff, while also we both got through The Door in the Wall and watched The Door in the Wall, the short BBC film from back in the 50s.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's an interesting guy. He married his cousin when he was young.
British.
And then divorced her because he was philandering around with someone else. and then living separately or something along those lines. They got a divorce, and then he just chronically cheated on his new wife throughout his life. And when someone would piss him off about it, he would write them into his stories.
Huh.
A real bitchy queen in the early 20th century, just like real petty. As he got older, most of his best known work was 1895 to 1900. There was like this period where he just... Time Machine comes out in 1895. Island of Dr. Moreau comes out in 1896. The Invisible Man comes out 97. War of the Worlds 98. War in the Air 1907. So like most of his well-known stuff was really early in his career. And then World War I happens. He's like very much a pacifist. He ends up going to the Soviet Union a number of times. 3 times, I believe. And the last time in the 1930s, he did a long interview with one Comrade Stalin, where he kind of gives a glowing but also critical review or overview of the Soviet Union in their talk.
Yeah.
So World War II then happens, and he's like writing histories. He does less fiction and more non-fiction. He wrote a children's history of like a Howard Zinn like history of the world kind of thing. And he became a politician. He ran as a labor member twice, and he basically during World War II just wrote everything and said, "I told you so."
Right.
And he died in 1946. So, what to say about his writing is that he's most associated with the schools of futurism, where he was a futurist, and kind of utopian science fiction.
I mean, proto-science fiction, in the same way as Lovecraft, things that would later become genre-defining. Particularly War of the Worlds, I think is probably, if only especially for the Orson Welles in America, it's probably the most well-known off the top of people's heads. And yeah, after that, maybe Time Machine, you know about the Morlocks, and then maybe you know about The Island of Dr. Moreau because it was that bad movie that actually will dovetail into a later thing of ours. Teaser, but you kind of almost like a Jack Reed, if English Jack Reed, the guy who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, except Jack Reed didn't have an early part of his career as a science fiction writer. It is funny, you could kind of view him as incidentally a science fiction writer who just did a bunch of other shit, but early in his career wrote some science fiction stories.
Yeah. He almost became an elder statesman by the end of his life. He has this real charisma. He seems like the type of person who would sit around and hold court, and tell people what he thinks about the world, and everybody kind of wrote that down. Mm-hmm. He also had a very funny voice, just like H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, no, this is an example of we had recorded sound for a while, actually, and a lot of these people were totally alive to get on tape, and maybe they shouldn't have been. But yeah, no, he definitely had that, Mary had a little lamb voice.
Here's a little bit of his...
It seems to me that many things besides the pound are threatened with collapse. The financial credit system is not working today. We have increased the productivity of our economic organization so greatly that a smaller and smaller proportion of people can produce everything that we need. The continent is...
So, what else to say about H.G. Wells the man?
Yeah, he was a little Fabian socialist boy who was generally of upper crust English, lineage that had him be kind of also within like government and social circles at the time, and he wrote a couple of science fiction stories that are pretty famous.
I'd say a free thinker, kind of in the line of like a utopian socialist, if I were to describe his, like a Fourier, like a very early socialist before kind of the Russian Revolution.
Right. I mean, he's within the Fabian tradition, so like he would be within that general democratic transition, non-Marxist socialism that sort of developed specifically in England out of 19th century like Chartist movements, and like also the Reform movement in the early 19th century that then kind of got integrated as a general plank of the Labour Party. Still vaguely existent. It's when they talk about like, oh, the Labour Party at one point was a social democratic party. It's sort of the thing they're referring to. But I mean, also even the thing to keep in mind about the quote-unquote Fabian Society is it was a gentleman's club modeled on the English model of gentlemen's clubs that, you know, explicitly excluded like actual working class participation. It was also a marker of you are a wealthy liberal as well.
Which is why I kind of use the term progressive before socialist.
Yeah. The Fabians call themselves socialists. But yeah, it's a thing in England. It was more of a thing in the late 19th century.
Right. All right, so now we're going to take a short little break and play some of... We found this wonderful version of The Door in the Wall from 1956. It's like a half hour. I know there are other versions. I think there's one from 2011. But we watched the one from 1956 because it is known as an experimental / avant-garde film in the 50s, and I didn't know what that looked like, so we watched it. So
yeah.
If you do want to, it's on YouTube, but here's some sound from it.
Meant to come back soon, but I ran after a cat, and I followed the birdman with gold spectacles, and I found a green door in a white wall. Inside was the garden I told you about. It was...
He's a willful, stubborn child, with all respect to my dear sister, and a born liar.
Frankie, go to your room.
All right, that was some horrifying childhood trauma from The Door in the Wall, 1956. And yeah, why is Fisher reading this to contrast with H.P. Lovecraft?
He approaches it as kind of this presentation of the weird that is different than Lovecraft's presentation of the weird, but nonetheless falls within his definition of the weird. So by giving you a second example that's not like the first example, we can tease out what the meaning of the weird is. I mean, it's pretty much structurally why it's in the book, why it's following immediately after the Lovecraft chapter. So, I mean, briefly, I don't know, do you want to describe the plot of The Door in the Wall? There's a door in the wall.
The plot of The Door in the Wall is these two older gentlemen are talking. Redmond and a politician named Lionel Wallace. And Wallace seems troubled, seems dour, and he starts to tell Lionel Wallace about this door in the wall that he ran into as a child in London. And so he went through the door, and yeah, like it is strange. He was kind of apprehensive at the time, and then he goes in and it's like a surrealist painting. The one thing that I know, that I remember that's very striking about him going in as a child was seeing a panther, and I think there's flamingos described. Wallace mused before he went on, telling me, "You see, there were 2 great panthers there, yes, spotted panthers, and I was not afraid. There was a long, wide path with marble-edged flower borders on either side, and these 2 huge velvety beasts were playing there with a ball. One looked up and came towards me, a little curious as it seemed. It came right up to me, rubbed its soft round ear very gently against the small hand I held out and purred. It was, I tell you, an enchanted garden." I know. And the size? Oh, it stretched far and wide, this way and that. I believe there were hills far away. Heaven knows where West Kensington had suddenly got to. And somehow it was just like coming home. So he has this experience. He eventually finds a book in the garden, and he looks in the book after finding. He has a girlfriend, like a little girlfriend with a monkey, and then he goes to the book, and then he finds himself back outside the door, or like he ends up.
He's back on the street and the door's
back
gone.
on the street outside the door.
Yeah.
And the door's gone?
Or, is the door gone at this? I don't know. The point is, he finds this mysterious door in the middle of the city. He goes through. It's this idyllic garden with things that ought not to be in the middle of London, and then mysteriously can't find the door again. And then at varying points in the rest of his life, he sees the door again a few times. He never goes in because he's always on his way to something else. At one point, he, does the, proverbial, I'm sure you've seen the trope, like, told a bunch of kids about the door in the wall. They're like, all right, show us or else we're kicking your ass. Brings them to where he saw the door's not there, they kick his ass. But yeah, he never goes back through the door, and now he's in his old age, lamenting that he's never gone through the door because he's essentially always pursued the things, his worldly responsibilities.
Yeah, it's described that, like, every time he sees the door, he's on his way to his father's funeral, he's on his way to a debate, or he wants a promotion at a job, and he's always rushing around, but he can never forget the enchanted garden behind the door, so he always wishes he could see it again.
Right.
And like he's haunted by it, and here Fisher quotes, "Years of hard work after that, and never a sight of the door. It's only recently it has come back to me. With it there has come a sense as though some thin tarnish has spread itself over my world. I began to think of it as a sorrowful and bitter thing that I should never see that door again. Perhaps I was suffering a little from overwork. Perhaps it was what I had heard spoken of as the feeling of 40. I don't know. But certainly the keen brightness that makes effort easy has gone out of things recently."
So, getting to be an old man, and he resolves, fucking, I'm going through the door next time I see it. Redmond says, all right, good night, you old weirdo. And then essentially the next day, they find this guy, Wallace's body, in a construction site behind an apparent green door in the wall.
Yeah.
So it's this big, was he fantasizing this the whole time? Was this just some, like, thing he, like, remembered as a child, but it didn't actually happen? And I think there's a, like, surface level understanding of the story as, like, a nostalgic, like, this innocence of childhood that he could never quite recapture because of his earthly responsibilities prevented him from doing so until... That's the story, though.
Yeah, that's the story. And so Fisher compares it with Lovecraft, saying, "Why should the door in the wall be classified as a weird tale? The problem of worlds, of contact between incommensurable worlds, is clearly something that the story shares with Lovecraft, and this brings us once again to the heart of the weird. As we began to explore in the last chapter, weird fiction always presents us with a threshold between worlds. The door in the wall evidently centers on just such a threshold. Much of its power derives from the opposition between the mundanity of the London setting with its quotidian details. He recalls a number of mean, dirty shops, and particularly that of a plumber and decorator with a dusty disorder of earthenware pipes, sheet lead ball taps, patterned balls of wallpaper, and tins of enamel, and the world beyond the door."
Right. So he really focuses in on this notion that the thing for Fisher that makes this a weird story is the setting within the setting of London. So if, for example, the entire story took place behind the door in the wall, you are just describing an idyllic garden. That might be a fantasy setting, but it wouldn't really be a weird setting.
Right.
Because things would belong to that. An interesting comparison he quickly makes that I always liked is this idea of Narnia, C.S. Lewis's weirdness rising from the lamppost along the fringes of Narnia, along that threshold, because it's this very modern urban thing put in an otherwise fantasy world. And sort of this is kind of that contrast where this is a fantasy world put in a modern urban context.
Right. He also compares it to Doctor Strange, David Lynch's films, which we're going to get to in a later chapter, Randolph Carter's Silver Key stories, where there's always this threshold, something that you either hold on to or you walk through, or you, like C.S. Lewis
Right.
and Narnia, this thing that mediates our world versus the outside world, or in this case, it's not even the outside world.
Or even with Lovecraft, I think the threshold is very much like this embedding of this like ancient, ominous outsideness within the fabric of our world in such a way that our world kind of falls apart on that embedded ancientness. Like, there's not a portal in the most literal sense, like the wardrobe from Lion Witch and the Wardrobe, or the door from Door in the Wall, but it's still this embedded outsideness that's placed along areas it shouldn't be.
It's interesting, this is the first time he's brought up the term enchanted, and I think that becomes a more and more useful description of things, especially when we get into the eerie, but this idea of the enchanted sense of place that a lot of these fictional stories bring to settings. And I think there's something to be said that in a lot of ways Lovecraft enchants his New England countryside with this ancient magic that hitherto you might not have known existed until you stumbled upon this Stonehenge in the woods, or
the blasted heath from Color Out of Space,
or found the Necronomicon.
Right, yeah. Like, but the Necronomicon is always in the context of it's in the library of a modern college.
Right.
Or in the middle of some town, there's just this clearing of woods where everything's burnt away and everything's dead, and that kind of a deal.
And the Necronomicon kind of explains the enchantment, why that is the way it is. And in here you don't really get an explanation or even an ontological certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And the enchantment, I think, works in a different way than Lovecraft, where you're sort of enchanting this urban space Whereas in Lovecraft, you're kind of enchanting these more rural or backwater towns that are outside the city that you have to go to from these cosmopolitan centers. And in the conservative way, like, you have to enrich your sense of self by going out there.
Yeah, the first contrast he draws with Lovecraft is what you mentioned as the ontological certainty. So in the case of The Door in the Wall, very notably, it's presented in such a way where this could all be Wallace's fantasy. Particularly, the end is a very classic, oh, did this all really happen? Oh, maybe it was his like, everyone's gonna walk away thinking Wallace kind of went crazy. He went through some random door, it was a closed off construction site, and he ended up dying. And it's never really resolved. No one else ever saw the door in the wall. He only has these memories when he was a child of the door in the wall. Whereas with Lovecraft, there's never a question over whether any of this shit is real. Even if the evidence presented is like dreams and like vague, like anthropological presumptions, very quickly on, the horror arises from knowing Cthulhu is real, arises from knowing you actually spent the last 10 years body switched with the great race of Yith, knowing all these things. And to the extent that there is an unreliable narrator or even a descent into insanity, which is a theme associated with Lovecraft, that arises as a result of this very real experience that was had. The experience is never a questionable thing that happened because you're insane. You're insane because of the thing that happened. So that's, I think, the first...
That's the second difference. The first difference that Fisher makes is that Lovecraft uses inhumanity and unhumanness to horrify or to bring about this sense of existential dread, because how can you live in the world where this exists, blah, blah, blah. Whereas H.G. Wells, everything is human. Everything is exists within this world. Its weirdness is just defined by its, its strangeness is not that it's inhuman. It's that it is human and it still exists within the context. Second one is what you said, the ontological uncertainty, whether or not it's a hallucination or not, and the suspense about whether or not it happens or not.
And I mean, I guess that does bleed into, he kind of delineated out this third difference of insanity, but also to kind of expand on the idea of the humanness. And it really gets to one of the main differences I meant to mention when we were just talking about Wells. But, just the fact that H.P. Lovecraft is a weird misanthrope who writes exceedingly pessimistic stories. Wells, even War of the Worlds, ends optimistically. They all kind of end in a somewhat optimistic manner. He presents his ideas in a ultimately hopeful light. He presents his ideas of the future as this pushing the boundaries of man's progress and pushing the boundaries of what we can discover and how we can improve ourselves, rather than Lovecraft sort of saying we should stop pushing the boundaries. I think is probably an overall...
Yeah, he brings up Freud again. And this is interesting, I think, in the context of having watched the short film. He suspects that he might have augmented a childhood memory, redreamed it to the point of completely distorting it. And we had a running joke while watching it, because in the film, he passes by this weird guy who's giving out bread to pigeons, and then he eats part of the bread, and then he sees the door for the first time and goes through it. And when he comes back from the door, he sitting by the side of the road crying, and it just seems like that guy probably did something fucked up to him and made him go into this hallucinatory state.
Yeah, that's definitely a very cynical, I think, post-2000 way of analyzing that short film that at least sort of seems obvious to me somehow. I don't think it was intended, but
no.
I also don't think I'm the only weirdo who would offer that as an interpretation.
Well, and even going on that, like, it also, he goes home after crying for having to leave his enchanted garden, if we're accepting that actually happened. And he goes home and he gets beat by his uncle.
Right, well, father. I mean, this is also going to the very straightforward interpretation that it's like, I don't know, Mountain Goat's fucking best ever death metal band out of Denton. Like, just this very, like, oh, it's the childhood creativity that society is forcing you to suppress. It's the childhood innocence, desire to explore, desire to see the enchantment in the mundane that society is constantly suppressing because you have to get a job and do stuff. There's a very, like, almost Pink Floyd The Wall thing with his dad, like...
Well, the whole thing seems like The Wall almost took cues from these characters.
Yeah, it's sort of a sober Wall.
Yeah, the little kid, the kind of upperclassness, the private school, and then the domineering patriarchal father.
Yeah, I mean, also, let's not let us get away from the fact that England is literally a real place that has these social conventions that both The Wall and this is working in. I don't know that everything made in England is eternally referenced. But yeah, no, yeah.
Tell me one more thing. Do you think you'll ever see that door again? How can I tell? Probably not. And if you do? I shall go in, of course. Good night. Good night, Frank.
Alright, so then we get to what Fisher considers the most inherent difference between Lovecraft and Wells in sort of a meta-fiction way, which is that there is longing. Longing within this story, whereas in Lovecraft, there is no longing. He says here, but perhaps the most decisive difference between The Door in the Wall and Lovecraft consists in the quality of longing that is central to Wells's story. In Lovecraft, the positive lore of the outside has to be repressed and inverted, transformed into loathing and dread, but the appeal of the world beyond the door shines through the door in the wall. The key opposition structuring the story is not naturalism versus the supernatural. There is little to suggest that the world behind the wall is supernatural, though it is certainly enchanted. It is the opposition between the quotidian and the numinous. Wallace's description of an indescribable quality of translucent unreality, different from the common things of experience that hung about it all, recalls Rudolf Otto's characterization of the numinous in the idea of the holy. Yet, for both Wallace and Otto, an indescribable quality of translucent unreality accompanies encounters with that which is more real than the common things of experience. The real does not feel real. It involves a heightening of sensation, exceeds the parameters of ordinary experience, but to Wallace, at least the door in the wall has a real door leading through a real wall to immortal realities. And I think this gets to something you were saying earlier, certainly speaks to the enchantment, but there's this positivity. There's this socialist utopianism about this other world that he imagines. Even if that socialist utopianism is something that can never be attained again or never be experienced once again. And there's this almost nostalgia for it, but that nostalgia and longing are, this haunting feeling, which reminds me a lot of Ghosts of My Life and some of capitalist realism. And I think he mentions the numinous and Rudolph Otto.
He does, yeah.
In Ghosts of My Life. I think that's with the Red Riding series.
Yes, you're correct on that. Also, I mean, like, just on a basic level, like, would you ever use the word passion to describe anything in any Lovecraft? I mean, just this character has this, like, sort of humanist libidinal passion, almost, it's like a transcendent, like, almost sexuality about this, like, desire for the door in the wall. Whereas, like, any exploration of the characters, I mean, as we've mentioned, the characters in Lovecraft are often just tools to give scale to things, but to the extent that they have motives, it's generally not driven by passion or transcendence or libidinalness. It's usually driven by some academic duty, some familial duty, some
fascination.
Right, fascination. Yeah, a trepidatious, like, I'm an academic scientist and I'm exploring this problem that was presented by me, but I also don't really want to be on this path. Whereas this character is, spending his entire life trying to get back on this path. I think is, like, a very key difference. I've often joked, and I guess C.S. Lewis is reminding me, but, like, just I always say, like, there's more lustfulness in the way that Redwall describes a single scone than exists in all of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. But yeah, no, there's this very humanist romanticism in Wells that Lovecraft, I've read writings of Lovecraft specifically rejecting this as a thing that should ever appear in fiction, like on this principle that he invented for himself.
And what do you think that comes from? I guess it's interesting that both of these, there seems to be an almost resentment of modernity with Lovecraft, and with H.G. Wells there seems to be this wonderment, and at the same time this almost awe-inspired but also horrified. Like, he knows that modernity comes and war will come. And that seems very ingrained in his writing from the War of the Worlds onward, or even the Time Machine. This idea that modernity is setting in, and that means bigger guns, and that means bigger wars. But out of those wars, we're eventually going to find a more hopeful world after them.
Yeah, or Morlocks will eat us. I keep getting back to, it reminds me of the Polar Express. Is honestly the thing it reminds me of the most. It reminds me of one of those freaking childhood Toy Story Santa stories about, like, oh yeah, there was magic when you were a kid and then it faded away as you grew up, is a lot of the impression I got from The Door in the Wall. That seems to be, if not an intended theme, a theme that people have very easily read into since the story existed.
Yeah, except those narrators usually don't die immediately after they...
It's a little bit of a... it's almost not even a tragic death because he finally did the thing he desired to do.
Right.
Even if that is turning back. In order to go through the door in the wall, he would have had to give up on his responsibilities that required him to go to Oxford, that required him to enter Parliament, that required him to do this, that, and the other thing. That's the price of going through the door in the wall, and he finally resolved to pay that price. And if he went out on his own terms. His way of reading it, I think, is not unfair. Like, I don't think it's necessarily a sad ending. And there's a unclarity of the like actual reality of the world behind the door. And if it is real, there's an unclarity on how it mechanically works. I mean, for all I fucking know, his soul was transported to the garden behind the wall. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, he finally resolved to do something for himself after a life of essentially doing things because
Other people told him to.
yeah, or his social station was to do those things.
And that gets to the last paragraph that Fisher talks about, which is a plaything of the psychoanalytic death drive. I say that it's a depressing ending, maybe less so because of his death, but because of the melancholy he experiences in the last scene that we see him.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like someone who's depressed, and the last words he says in the short story is like that he hates that he has to go back in the gray world again.
But then we see him not go back in the gray world again.
But we don't see his experience of feeling that pleasure, which I think, like, we only see the depressed side of that.
Or we see the evidence that he finally made that decision, as encapsulated in the fact that the Wallace that is the politician who is doing things because society tells him to do things is gone from this world now. It's kind of the interpretation I sort of got from it was actually this, yeah, I'm finally deciding to do something.
If we go with he's hallucinating and he finally gave in to the hallucination, would also be sort of an interpretation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the difference of optimism of this story is maybe giving into the hallucination isn't a bad thing, according to Wells.
Right.
It would be a bad thing according to Lovecraft. But, yeah, I mean, like I said, I kind of very much, this story reminded me specifically of Polar Express, but things like that kind of pattern of, like, sort of, I mean, what I argued in our Mountain Goats episode, that the Mountain Goats were actually kind of inverting and satirizing and attacking, but this is almost a version of the thing that they're attacking.
But the psychoanalytic death drive. Okay, so reflecting on Wallace's first encounter with the door, Redmond pictures the figure of that little boy, drawn and repelled. Freud describes the death drive in terms of just this ambivalent attraction towards what is unpleasurable. It is Lacan and his followers who have drawn out the strange geometries of the death drive, the way in which desire perpetuates itself by always missing its official object of satisfaction, just as Wallace repeatedly fails to go through the door, even though this is apparently his deepest desire. The pull exerted by the door and the garden deprives all of his worldly satisfactions and achievements of their flavor. To me, that still seems very gray and drab and sad, except maybe the ending that he maybe finally broke free.
Yeah, I mean, also, I think that I know the death drive doesn't mean what we generally assume it means, but, like, it is sort of this pleasure-seeking aspect, and I mean, I don't know, even this fucking Heideggerian sense of because we are ever going towards death, that is the pull from which we can create meaning for ourselves. Mm-hmm. I think there's some of that idea as well in there.
Yeah.
You know, he could have just continued being a miserable fucking politician, or he could just say fuck it to everything. And I feel like this is almost a very 90s to 2000s story of saying fuck it to everything. You know what it's like? It's like the ending of fucking Point Break. It's like the ending of fucking Point Break, where Bodhisattva's like finally found the fucking wave that he's riding, and Keanu Reeves like, I gotta stop you, and he's like, I gotta go, or whatever the fuck, and then Keanu Reeves just lets him go, and all of Keanu Reeves' cop friends are like, Well, we'll get him when he comes back, and Keanu Reeves is like,
Vaya con Dios.
What do you think you're doing? You let him go! No, I didn't.
He's not coming back, and then he throws his badge into the ocean.
yeah, no, it's like that. It's like that. Like, that is not a sad ending, even though he fucking died. You know, his character finally achieved...
and that is like the perfect death drive.
Right, exactly. Okay, yeah. No, it's like the end of Point Break. Yeah.
All right, yeah. You've convinced me. It's a happy ending.
Yeah.
All right, and so we'll end here with the last sentence that is spoken. The door was always a threshold leading beyond the pleasure principle and into the weird.
And into the Twilight Zone. Yeah.
All right, we'll see you next week with The Fall, and we might have a special guest, so
Yep.
see you next week.